A much-needed victory in the British Grand Prix for Charles Leclerc provided a clear signal that he might have at last cracked the problems that have been holding him back in Formula 1 recently, and we've learned some fascinating details about how Leclerc was finally able to turn the tide against Lewis Hamilton in his own backyard of Silverstone. Leclerc has been through a rough patch of form, retiring from 2 out of the 3 races prior to Silverstone and crashing twice in that time, while watching teammate Hamilton become increasingly assured and assertive inside Ferrari. F1, like any professional sport, is a mental game as much as a technical one, and just as Hamilton has grown increasingly confident after taking Ferrari's first win of 2026 in Barcelona, talking of changes inside the Ferrari team and to the car that he has pushed for, so Leclerc has had to face a barrage of negative questions about his own form as the bad weekends piled up. So the first thing Leclerc had to do was try to block out that negativity and keep our heads down while trying to figure out how to get his season back on track. Step 1 was to cancel that noise and remember that I didn't become a bad driver from one day to the other. As is often the case in this modern age we live in, that process began with what you might call a digital detox. Leclerc basically stopped doom scrolling and put down his phone in order to have what he calls the right picture of the situation and not be unduly influenced by those negative storylines. The irony is not lost on us here at the race that we are now pumping Leclerc up into hero status after his drought-ending win. But even though he ultimately owed it in part to the wheel shield failure that befell championship leader Kimi Antonelli late on, the real significance of this result is what it means for Leclerc's self-confidence and what it says about the evolving internal dynamic at Ferrari. The Silverstone weekend actually began with Leclerc once again on the back foot. As Hamilton took sprint pole by just 11 thousandths of a second over Antonelli, Leclerc qualified more than 3 tenths down on Hamilton in 5th and finished the 17-lap sprint race almost 10 seconds behind his teammate. It was at this point Leclerc said he spotted something in Ferrari's data that made him think he needed a change of approach. Obviously, we don't have access to Ferrari's rich layer of data, but from this GP tempo trace we can get a general sense of where Leclerc was shipping that time to Hamilton in sprint qualifying. The delta showed there's basically nothing to choose between them across the first part of the lap. Hamilton was quicker through the Village Loop complex, Leclerc gained that time back through Brooklands and Luffield. But Hamilton gained time on the following straight, through Copse where he barely lifted off the throttle and used a higher gear than Leclerc did, and a massive chunk through the final chicane, where Leclerc arrived slower, presumably related to battery depletion, but also used significantly more throttle than Hamilton through the crucial exit phase of that sequence. Leclerc also had spells through the lap where his engine's RPM was higher and he was using a gear lower than Hamilton. Come Grand Prix qualifying, the picture shifted. Leclerc's engine RPM and gear pattern was a close match for Hamilton's. Leclerc gained on the straights he was previously losing time on, he gained on Hamilton through Copse, and the Maggots-Beckett sequence, gained a fraction through Stowe, and was much better than before through the final chicane, with a throttle trace that more closely matched what Hamilton was doing the day before. Qualifying on the front row, alongside Antonelli and almost 2 tenths clear of Hamilton, was the foundation upon which Leclerc built his first F1 victory in more than 20 months. And what data we do see suggests Leclerc made a fundamental adjustment to the way he was attacking these corners. After Grand Prix qualifying, Leclerc spoke about facing a choice between completely adjusting his driving style to replicate what Hamilton's been doing recently, or trying to find a way to bring the Ferrari setup into a place where Leclerc can do what comes naturally to him without paying a price. Leclerc describes his own driving style as quite aggressive, and we know in the past he has conjured some magical qualifying laps by attacking corner entries, overlapping the brakes and throttle to load up the outside tyres more progressively, and carry huge corner speed without paying a penalty on the way out. But he says he has found it incredibly difficult to put things together in these 2026 cars, with their smaller tyre profiles, reduced downforce, and oddball battery-dominated power units. What's noticeable from the data we showed you earlier is that Leclerc's GP qualifying traces indicate a driver who was much more confident applying the throttle. Between Village and the Loop, he was much more aggressive than the day before. The same between Brooklands and Luffield. There was no visible lift off the throttle at Copse, and he was generally just being much more decisive with his inputs. This would suggest that Leclerc had more confidence in how much rear grip his Ferrari was producing, and also that maybe Ferrari dialed in a setup that allowed him to rotate the car better through those corners so he could apply the throttle more aggressively without worrying he was still holding too much steering lock or risking a sudden snap of oversteer. Leclerc described this process of improvement through the Silverstone weekend as intuition mixed with feeling, rather than a case of something black and white jumping out from the data. But it's interesting to note how much closer his basic data trace was to Hamilton's come Grand Prix qualifying, and Hamilton himself suggested he had played a major part in how Leclerc's race-winning weekend came together. Hamilton has spoken recently about how essentially ignoring Ferrari's pre-race simulator predictions has been helping him dial in better for race weekends. It's something he used to do when riding high in his former Mercedes days, and returning to this old school approach has helped him start off on the right foot consistently since Canada in late May. At Silverstone, Hamilton suggested it was this same approach that was key to him being so strong in sprint qualifying, where everyone came into that session with only one practice session with which to judge reality against their expectations. He said Ferrari's simulator indicated we should start in a much different place with the setup for Silverstone, but he and his team decided to stay with the direction we would normally go. And Hamilton says, crucially, having followed the direction of the simulator initially, Leclerc then diverted to Hamilton's setup direction for the rest of the weekend. This might sound like a defeated driver trying to steal limelight from their teammate, and maybe there's a bit of that going on here, but it's also quite common for F1 drivers to adopt the setup direction of their teammate if it's faster and they can make it work with their own driving. It's something Hamilton did plenty of times during his Mercedes title-winning years against Nico Rosberg and Valtteri Bottas, and it shows also that Leclerc understands the value of what he can learn from a 7-time champion in the same team, adopting Hamilton's approach and making it work better for him, unlike at Barcelona, where Leclerc crashed trying to replicate Hamilton's faster driving through turn 4. Hamilton learned particularly against Rosberg the value of getting the car to do the work, rather than always relying on superior driving talent, and that's likely to be just as powerful for a driver so naturally gifted as Leclerc is. Leclerc has already migrated to the carbon industry brake material favoured by Hamilton, and that Hamilton says he had to push extremely hard behind the scenes for Ferrari to introduce, and so there is more than one example here of Leclerc needing to follow the technical direction instigated by his much more decorated and successful teammate. The front suspension too is another area Hamilton says Ferrari has adjusted for this season according to his preference. But it's also true that Ferrari has ultimately decided these directions are in the best interests of the entire team, not just Hamilton, so Leclerc has had to adjust. Team boss Fred Vasseur reckons what we've seen in Leclerc's wayward form recently are the blips that can come while having to make these adjustments before a driver finds their confidence with the changes. When it came to the British Grand Prix itself, it was Hamilton paying the price for diverging from Leclerc's preferred setup direction, with Hamilton adjusting his front wing angle to reduce front grip, feeling the car was oversteering too much in qualifying, while Leclerc went in the opposite direction. Hamilton says he made some alterations to his car's differential settings through the first stint of the race to make it turn in better, but by then the gap was already huge. Had he not made that false start, where an involuntary movement of his hand on the clutch caused the car to move before the red lights went out, Hamilton would have finished second to Leclerc, even with the late pit stop under the safety car that ultimately dropped him behind George Russell's Mercedes. But regardless of those mistakes, this was very much a race where Hamilton was made to look second best by Leclerc, for the first time since before F1's enforced April hiatus. As Hamilton said pre-weekend, people tend to listen to you less when you're getting bad results, so this win should give Leclerc a much needed boost in confidence. Of course, had Kimi Antonelli's wheel shield not dislodged itself over the exit curb of Copse, Leclerc may very well have finished second in this race, presuming Antonelli could have passed him before Max Verstappen's Red Bull rear wing failed at Stowe. Ferrari was much more competitive overall at Silverstone than anticipated pre-weekend, and doesn't seem to really understand why that is yet either, but it's still the case that Antonelli took pole by nearly 0.2 of a second and was the fastest driver in race trim too, despite making a poor start. But even if Leclerc hadn't ultimately ended a personal victory drought stretching back to 2024's United States Grand Prix, this ended up being a weekend on a track where Hamilton is mightier than most, where Leclerc emphatically stopped the rot in the all-important intra-team Ferrari battle. The question now, as Leclerc well knows, is whether he can translate this marked improvement elsewhere.